I knew something was wrong the second I saw my own fence painted green. Not repaired, painted. Like somebody had already decided it belonged to them now. Then I saw the little wooden sign hanging off the gate, fresh white letters still dripping in the August heat. Willow Creek Community Garden. And right there, standing in the middle of my pasture like she was hosting a damn ribbon-cutting ceremony, was Denise Harper smiling at me with a watering can in her hand. End quote. "Morning, Walter," end quote. She said, "Calm as church on Sunday." End quote. "Try not to drive through the tomatoes." End quote. I just sat there in my truck for a second with both hands on the steering wheel, because when you and Oppos, re 68 years old, and you and Oppos, V, is spent your whole life measuring property lines for other people, you learn real quick that the most dangerous folks in America aren't and Oppos. T criminals, they and Oppos. Re neighbors who think they and Oppos. Re morally right. C, my name and Oppos, S. Walter Grady, retired land surveyor, widower, Army Reserve back in the 80s, and for almost 20 years I and Oppos, D been living alone outside a little town called Belmere, Kansas, on 36 acres my wife and I bought before the place got swallowed up by suburban developments and HOA newsletters. Back then it was cattle land and wheat fields. Quiet. Honest. Then the city started creeping outward, bringing in folks who wanted, end quote, country living, end quote, as long as it came with paved jogging trails and decorative mailboxes. The back section of my land, about 12 acres behind the creek, was rough pasture. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Fenced clean, taxed clean, deeded clean since 1999. My wife Claire used to call it our breathing room. After she passed from pancreatic cancer, I and Oppos, D go sit back there evenings just to hear the wind hit the tall grass, because sometimes silence is the only thing that doesn't and Oppos, T ask anything from you. Then came the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Denise Harper got elected president 6 months after moving in from Denver, and I swear that woman treated neighborhood meetings like Senate hearings. She had binders for everything. Smile sharp enough to cut wire. The kind of person who says, end quote, we and Oppos, rebuilding community, end quote, when what she really means is, end quote, we and Oppos, retaking control, end quote. At first, it was harmless enough. They wanted matching fences, holiday decoration guidelines, complaints about my tractor sitting visible from the road. I ignored most of it. But one spring afternoon, Denise knocked on my door carrying banana bread and paperwork, which is never a good combination. She told me the HOA wanted to build a small community garden for the neighborhood kids. End quote. Just a little corner of your back field, end quote, she said. End quote. Raised beds, maybe some flowers, educational opportunities, end quote. I remember laughing because she said educational opportunities like she was applying for federal funding. I told her no, politely at first. She kept smiling, said the land wasn't Oppos, T being used anyway. That one stuck with me. Folks always think and used means available. I told her my answer wasn't Oppos, T changing. A week later, she emailed me an official proposal with sketches attached. Then another board member stopped me at the gas station talking about, end quote, community partnerships, end quote. Finally, I mailed them a certified letter. Simple wording. Permission denied. No temporary use agreement authorized. Any unauthorized development constitutes trespassing. I thought that would end Oppos, V ended it. Hell, I spent 40 years around deeds and easements and boundary disputes. Most people back off once they realize paperwork exists. But Denise, she wasn't Oppos, T stupid. That and Oppos, that's what made her dangerous. She understood something most decent people don't and Oppos, T want to admit. If enough people publicly act like something belongs to them long enough, eventually everybody else starts feeling awkward questioning it. And over the next few months, that and Oppos, that's exactly what happened. First, somebody mowed a path through my pasture. Then little wooden stakes appeared. Then one Saturday morning I woke up and saw 8 people building raised garden beds on my property like it was a church volunteer event. I drove out there furious, but the second I stepped out of my truck, Denise walked toward me holding lemonade like we were at a family picnic. End quote. Walter, end quote. She said softly, end quote. You should see how excited the kids are. End quote. I looked past her and saw families laughing, planting seeds, taking photos, and for one ugly little moment, I felt like the villain in my own story. Then Denise leaned closer and quietly said, end quote, sometimes communities outgrow old boundaries, and quote. That and Apos. That's the moment I realized this wasn't Apos. Tea about gardening anymore. It was about power. And standing there in the Kansas heat listening to strangers hammer posts into my land while pretending they were doing something noble, I made a decision that would split that neighborhood clean down the middle. Now, I wish I could tell you I handled all this like some cold genius sitting 3 moves ahead on a chessboard. But the truth is, for about 2 weeks, I was just angry. Quite angry. The kind that settles into your chest and keeps you awake at 2 in the morning replaying conversations you should and Apos. V ended differently. Every time I drove past that field, there was something new. More planter boxes. Solar lights along the path. Somebody hung little painted rocks beside the tomatoes with children and Apos' names on them. Emma and Apos' carrots. Jacob and Apos' peppers. Cute stuff. Smart stuff. Denise knew exactly what she was doing. Once children become attached to something, nobody wants to be the old man who tears it away. And around town, the story started changing shape. Funny how that happens. By the time it reached the diner downtown, folks wearing and Apos' saying, and quote, the HOA built on Walter and Apos' land, and quote. They were saying, and quote, Walter and Apos' fighting the neighborhood garden, and quote. Real subtle difference there, but important. One afternoon I stopped into Parker and Apos' feed store, and old Jim Parker looked over the counter and said, and quote, heard you and Apos' trying to shut down the kids and Apos' garden, and quote. Kids and Apos' garden. Not trespassing. Not unauthorized development. Kids and Apos' garden. I just stood there holding a bag of mineral salt thinking, damn. Denise already won the public relations battle. Then came the letter. Certified mail. Thick envelope. Real official looking. It stated the Willow Creek Garden Project had been recognized by the Township Beautification Committee as a protected community enrichment initiative and requested I, and quote, refrain from disruptive interference while civic review processes remain ongoing, end quote. Civic review processes. That and Apos' lawyer language forestall him until everybody forgets who owns the dirt. I read that thing 3 times sitting at my kitchen table while my coffee went cold. What bothered me wasn't Apos' the legal nonsense because honestly, it didn't and Apos' hold much weight. What bothered me was the confidence. Somebody over there genuinely believed social pressure could override ownership. And maybe these days, sometimes it can. Couple nights later my daughter Rachel called from Oklahoma after seeing neighborhood photos online. End quote. Dad, end quote. She said carefully, end quote. Maybe just let them use the land. Mom probably would and Apos' end quote. That one hurt more than anything Denise ever said. Because Claire probably would have. My wife had a soft spot for community projects and struggling young families and stray dogs and every broken thing that crossed her path. But Claire also believed in respect. You asked permission. You honored boundaries. You didn't and Apos' just take things because your intentions sounded wholesome. I remember sitting there after Rachel hung up, staring out toward the dark pasture, wondering if grief had turned me stubborn or if everybody else had simply stopped understanding the difference between kindness and surrender. 3 mornings later, I got my answer. I drove out to check my south fence line around 7 a.m. and found 3 women harvesting vegetables from beds sitting squarely on my property. One of them was Denise. Another was her husband, Brent, taking photos with his phone like they were documenting history. I climbed out of the truck and said, calm as I could, and quote, you people need to leave, end quote. Denise didn't and Apos' even look nervous. That part still amazes me. She stood there brushing dirt off gardening gloves and said, end quote, Walter, this is protected community space now, end quote. Protected. Like they and Apos' conquered it. I pointed toward the fence posts, end quote. I have the deed in my truck, end quote. And Denise smiled, actually smiled, and said, end quote, sometimes legal ownership ISN and Apos' the same as moral ownership, end quote. There it was. The whole philosophy sitting naked in the sunlight. They thought because they planted vegetables and involved children and held potluck dinners beside my creek, they had transformed my property into something ethically theirs. And maybe part of Denise even believed she was helping the town evolve past selfish old ideas about land ownership. But here in Apos' the thing people never understand about old surveyors. We remember history differently than everybody else. I and Apos' Seen brothers sue brothers over 6 inches of property line. Seen widows lose homes because somebody trusted a handshake agreement from 20 years earlier. Boundaries matter because eventually somebody always tests them. I looked at Denise for a long moment that morning, and suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, because there was one detail nobody in that HOA had bothered researching. Back in 1999, when Claire and I bought the property, the previous owner had sold off limited grazing access easements to a neighboring rancher, but he never separated the mineral rights. Most people don't to even think about mineral rights unless they rich oil families down in Texas. But in Kansas, especially around old farmland, subsurface rights can get weird. And as a surveyor, made damn sure every clause stayed attached to my name when we bought the place. Natural gas exploration, underground access, surface disruption permissions tied to extraction surveys. Never used any of it because honestly there was never a reason. Until Denise. So that afternoon, I made a phone call to a man named Curtis Bell. Curtis ran regional surveys for a small propane and natural gas exploration company out of Wichita. We and worked together years ago on pipeline easements. Good guy. Talk slow. Choose sunflower seeds constantly. I asked him one simple question. End quote. Curtis, you still running exploratory surface scans out near Bell County? End quote. Long silence. Then he laughed. End quote. Walter Grady, end quote. He said. End quote. You finally sitting on money? End quote. I told him probably not, but I sure as hell might be sitting on leverage. By the next morning, Curtis and 2 field supervisors were reviewing my deed paperwork at my dining room table. Curtis kept shaking his head smiling. End quote. These folks really built permanent structures without checking subsurface rights? End quote. I poured him coffee. End quote. Apparently they were too busy saving the community. End quote. Around noon, Curtis folded the paperwork shut and said the most beautiful sentence I and heard in months. End quote. Legally speaking, you can shut that entire garden down tomorrow. End quote. And here in where some people watching this are probably thinking I went too far. Maybe I did. Maybe grief and pride and months of humiliation finally boiled over into something meaner than I intended. But understand something. I had tried the polite route. I said no. Repeatedly. In writing. They ignored me because they assumed social pressure would make me cave eventually. Denise thought public opinion was stronger than contract law. So the next morning at exactly 11:42 a.m., while half the neighborhood was out watering cucumbers and posting photos online about sustainable living, 2 white utility trucks rolled slowly down the gravel access road behind my pasture, followed by a portable drilling rig and 4 men in orange safety vests carrying survey markers. You wouldn't thought aliens landed. Denise came running before the engines even shut off. End quote. What is this? End quote. She yelled. Curtis climbed out chewing sunflower seeds. End quote. Surface Mineral Exploration Survey, Am. End quote. Denise looked confused for maybe 2 seconds, then pale. Real pale. End quote. You can drill here, end quote. She snapped. End quote. We have crops growing. End quote. Curtis pointed toward me leaning against my truck. End quote. Take it up with the property owner. End quote. Brent stormed over next, already recording on his phone. End quote. This is harassment, end quote. He barked. End quote. We have township protection status. End quote. Curtis just shrugged. End quote. Township recognition doesn't override mineral access rights in Kansas. End quote. Then he handed Brent a copy of the legal authorization. I and LL never forget watching Brent read the first paragraph because confidence drained out of his face line by line. Meanwhile, the crew started placing bright orange survey flags right through the middle of the garden beds. Tomatoes, lettuce, green beans. Didn't matter. One worker hammered a marker directly beside a little sign that said Sophia and S pumpkins. Denise looked like she might cry. And honestly, for half a second, I almost stopped the whole thing. Then she looked at me and said, end quote, you and redoing this to punish people, end quote. I answered, end quote, no. I and am doing this because you decided my no didn't and matter, end quote. By 2 that afternoon, 3 different board members had arrived. By 3:30, somebody called a county commissioner. And just before sunset, Denise finally brought a lawyer. Older guy named Marvin Kessler. Gray suit despite the heat. Carried himself like a man tired of cleaning up other people and Oppo's arrogance. He stood beside the garden reading my deed paperwork while everybody waited in dead silence. 1 minute passed, then another. Finally, Marvin lowered the papers, rubbed his forehead, and muttered the sentence that detonated the entire situation. End quote. He and Oppo's within his rights. End quote. Denise stared at him. End quote. There has to be something we can do. End quote. Marvin looked straight at her and said, almost annoyed, end quote. You built permanent community structures on privately owned land without a surface use agreement. What exactly did you think was going to happen? End quote. And right there, standing beside wilted tomato plants and orange survey flags under the Kansas sunset, the whole neighborhood finally realized the old man they and Oppo's been treating like a stubborn inconvenience had spent 40 years. Understanding land law better than any of them ever would. What happened after that spread through Belmere faster than a tornado warning. By the next morning, photos of the drilling rig sitting beside the community garden were all over Facebook. Half the comments called me a bully. The other half called Denise an entitled idiot. And somewhere in the middle were a bunch of exhausted neighbors realizing their peaceful little subdivision had accidentally turned into a property rights war. The exploration survey officially suspended all garden activity for 90 days. 90. In the middle of growing season. Nobody could access the beds while the surface review was active, which meant tomatoes rotted on the vine, cucumbers overgrew, and all those neat little family gardening posts online suddenly turned into angry HOA updates written in all caps. Denise tried salvaging the public narrative at first. She posted long statements about preserving community values and standing against intimidation tactics. But then somebody leaked the certified denial letter I and Oppo's sent months earlier. That changed everything. Because now people realized she hadn't and Oppo's misunderstood me. She and Oppo's ignored me. Deliberately. The local paper even ran a story with the headline Community Garden Dispute Exposes Property Rights Gap. They used a photo of one of Curtis and Oppo's orange survey markers sticking out beside a dying bean plant. Hell of an image. You could practically hear the argument just looking at it. A week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting at the middle school gymnasium. I almost didn't and Oppo's go, but Curtis talked me into it. End quote. If they and Oppo's gonna burn the town down, end quote. He said, end quote. You oughta at least watch the fire, end quote. So I went. Sat in the back row wearing an old denim jacket while nearly 50 residents argued themselves hoarse for over 2 hours. Some blamed Denise for overstepping. Others blamed me for escalating instead of compromising. One younger guy stood up and actually said, end quote, we were trying to create something beautiful and Mr. Grady weaponized legal technicalities against families, end quote, technicalities. That and Oppo's the word people use when laws become inconvenient. Then an older woman named Martha Reed stood up slowly near the front. Martha had lived in Belmere longer than anybody there besides me. Sweet woman. Brought casseroles to funerals. Never raised her voice. But that night she looked straight at the board and said, end quote, you Don and Oppo's get to teach children about community by teaching them it and Oppo's okay to take from somebody who already said no, end quote. Whole room went quiet after that. Even Denise. Especially Denise. Because deep down, I think she finally realized this stopped being about gardens weeks ago. It became about ego. About proving she could bend a stubborn old man into cooperating for the greater good. And the thing about people who are addicted to feeling morally correct, eventually they stop noticing when they become cruel. 6 board members resigned before the meeting ended. Brent Harper stormed out halfway through after somebody accused him of trying to increase neighborhood property values by turning my pasture into a, end quote, community lifestyle feature, end quote, which honestly, wasn't and Oppo's entirely wrong. See, I eventually learned something else. A developer had been sniffing around Willow Creek for expansion opportunities, and community amenities increased appraisal numbers. Walking trails, shared gardens, green spaces. Denise probably started with genuine intentions. I believe that. But somewhere along the line, idealism mixed with ambition and turned into entitlement. Happens all the older somehow. End quote. Can we talk? End quote. She asked. We sat on my porch while cicadas screamed in the trees, and neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Then she finally said, end quote, you embarrassed me. End quote. I remember laughing at that because after everything that happened, that was apparently the wound she cared about most. Not the legal disaster. Not the division in the neighborhood. Embarrassment. I told her, end quote. Denise, you built a public project on private land after I told you no 3 separate times. End quote. She stared out toward the pasture and quietly said, end quote, people needed something hopeful around here. End quote. And that right there, that and Oppos. That's the part that still sticks with me. Because she wasn't and Oppos, T entirely wrong. Belmere had changed. Families moved in, but nobody really knew each other anymore. Folks waved from garages, then disappeared inside. The garden did bring people together for a little while. Kids learned how vegetables grew. Elderly couples spent evenings outside again. For a moment, it probably felt like community. But good intentions Don and Oppos, T erase boundaries. That and Oppos. That's the lesson people keep trying to skip. Denise eventually asked what it would take to end the survey suspension permanently. I told her the same thing I should and Oppos, VE demanded from the beginning. Respect. In legal form. 2 weeks later, the HOA signed a formal surface use agreement drafted by my attorney. Month-to-month access lease. $2,400 monthly usage fee. $300 penalty for late payment. Full liability coverage. And most importantly, unilateral revocation rights with 30 days notice if any expansion occurred without written approval. Every single page notarized. Every line crystal clear. When we finished signing, Denise slid the papers back toward me and said, almost under her breath, end quote, you couldn't Oppos. V just talk to us. End quote. I looked at her for a long second because maybe part of me did wonder if I and Oppos, D gone nuclear when I could and Oppos, VE handled things softer. Maybe Claire would and Oppos, VE handled it softer. But then I remembered standing in my own field while strangers acted like I was trespassing on land I and Oppos, D worked half my life to own. I remembered the painted fence, the signs, the children being used like emotional shields. And I said the only honest thing left. End quote. I did talk to you. End quote. After that, things settled down. The garden stayed. Rent checks arrived on time every month. Curtis never found enough gas underground to make drilling worthwhile, though he still sends me Christmas cards joking that my tomatoes are sitting on top of the world and Oppos' smallest propane reserve. Denise resigned from the HOA before winter. Last I heard, she and Brent moved to Colorado Springs. Some people in Belmere still think I overreacted. Others think I saved every property owner in town from a dangerous precedent. Truth is, maybe both are right. But I and Oppos, LL tell you this much. Every time I drive past that garden now, I notice something that wasn't Oppos, T there before. Right beside the entrance gate hangs a metal sign installed by the HOA after the settlement. Property used under legal agreement with owner permission. Small sign. Easy to miss. But to me, that and Oppos, that's the whole story right there. Because communities matter. Kindness matters. Shared spaces matter. But ownership matters too. Boundaries matter. And the second people convince themselves they and Oppos, morally justified ignoring your no. It rarely stops with gardens. So now I want to hear from you. Did I go too far? Should I have let the garden stay for free once the community got attached to it? Or was Denise the one who crossed the line the moment she ignored a legal boundary because she believed her cause mattered more? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, small-town power struggles, and moments where ordinary people push back in ways nobody expects, stick around. Because trust me, this wasn't Oppos. The first time somebody learned the hard way that paperwork can hit harder than pride.